Evolutionary science and Christianity are two entities that often find themselves at odds with each other. Some have tried to skirt their conflicting accounts by taking a perspective that suggests that each school of thought addresses different aspects of our humanity, with science addressing the question of how and Christianity addressing the question of why. It is commonly accepted as fact that this separation works only if Christian adherents are willing to accept a less than literal interpretation of the biblical accounts of creation. But is compromising on factual interpretation of the Bible the only way for evolution and Christianity to coexist peacefully?
We think there is another way. We propose that if we transform the way we read the Bible by understanding that it is not an all-inclusive account of events, it is entirely possible for Christianity to adopt the evolutionary worldview provided by science. The age of the biblical text is perhaps the most compelling reason to adjust our interpretation of it, particularly the creation story it contains. 2,000 years ago, it would have been impossible to achieve the in-depth understanding of how our world works from a practical level that is required to understand ourselves and our universe as an evolving entity. Assuming the Bible was divinely inspired, it seems very unlikely that the authors would have had much luck spreading the word of God had they talked about the biological relationship between humans and apes, or the way we reproduce through DNA and RNA on a molecular level. Without a basic understanding of how these mechanisms work, it would have been all too easy to dismiss these writings as insane or even sorcery. So these ancient authors had a less scientific version of events given to them, but room was still left to allow for our emergent knowledge to enrich our understanding as we have acquired a more refined, practical understanding of our world.
One biblical author, Isaiah, spoke of life coming forth in a manner that is supported by our scientific knowledge. Isaiah 42:5 describes the life as emerging from a fabric spun by God, who has created the heavens and stretched them out, who has hammered the earth and what emerges from it. All of life emerges from the original fabric God created. It is a description quite fitting with our most current understanding of the framework of the entire universe as a fabric of time stretched out by the forces of nature. The fabric provides the material with which the natural forces interact and allows all the individual parts of the universe to emerge into being.
Another extremely well-known creation account, Genesis 1, the priestly creation story, describes creation as occurring within 7 days, first with the domains of heaven and earth, day and night, water and land, and then with the creatures meant to occupy each domain. The order of creation is of utmost importance. First the domains, and then the creatures. Birds for the sky, fish for the waters, beasts for the land. It is a very generalized description of life on our planet, but important because it explains that each creature was made especially for its domain. We aren't surprised by this. It seems pretty obvious. However, it is important to note that the Bible describes that these animals were created for their domain, and that is why they are able to live in those specific domains. This idea of creatures being made to thrive within specific domains ties strongly into the scientific ideas of biological adaptation and biological fitness. Creatures evolve slowly to increase their success at surviving within their habitat, occasionally even breaching their habitat to facilitate their ability to thrive. This overarching tendency towards increasing biological fitness based on a relationship between the environment and the survival of the organism is supported by the framework of domains described in Genesis 1.
The biblical account of creation also provides guidance for another common point of contention between science and religion: environmental concerns. With human-induced apocalyptic paranoia on one end of the debate, and fundamentalist Christians believing God has created all we need to survive until his final coming on the other end of the debate, there is a huge spectrum of concern regarding how humans are to handle our resources and what responsibility we have to use them efficiently. Science tends to lean heavily toward conservation, coexistence, and good stewardship of the earth. But Christianity supports these same ideas if their texts are given the right consideration. Genesis 1 describes man being made in God's image, and God set aside the seventh day of his creative act to enjoy the whole of his creation prior to the creation of mankind. So there's clearly a duty for man to enjoy his creation, but that's not the whole story. In being made after the rest of creation, it can be discerned that the whole of creation is the domain of man. This gives humanity a heavy responsibility. Because species are created for their domains, the destruction of a domain would also lead to the destruction of a species. Since humans were created in the image of God, we then have the responsibility to preserve the domains and ensure the survival of the species, at the very least our own species. However, in ensuring the survival of our own domain, we by extension must also ensure the survival of the individual domains and the species that reside within them.
The book of Job also implies that humans have a responsibility towards stewardship when considering this book's verses within the greater context of man being made in the image of God. Job, deeply frustrated with an unjust God after a stretch of extraordinary misfortune, cries out to God in frustration. God's response is a long series of questions that are impossible for Job to answer. Have you given the horse strength? Does the hawk fly by your wisdom? These questions are commonly interpreted to be God flexing his muscles in establishing humans' inferiority to himself. The language within these verses offers an opportunity for interpretation, though. There is a clear awe in the way God is describing his creation through this series of questions. He describes the gallop of a horse as being filled with fierceness and rage, and describes with pleasure how effectively a lion fits into her habitat and is able to feed her young. God's awe with the creation is most clear in his description of Behemoth, a creature esteemed to be chief in the ways of God, with his tail that moves like a cedar tree and the tightly knit sinews of his thighs. The speech is without a reference to the human's place within creation, but the fact that the speech is directed at a man, Job, suggests that it contains information God feels it would behoove man to consider. Considering the wonder and pleasure of God verbalized here, if we are truly to act in God's image, surely maintaining the beauty and integrity of the rest of his creation is a responsibility that we should closely hold.
Any attempts to reconcile the beliefs of Christian dogma and scientific knowledge would be incomplete without addressing the question of how God acts. People love to talk about their God as if he has an active role in their lives. Their child's health is by the grace of God, or they failed to get a promotion at work because God has other things in store for them. But humans are autonomous creatures, as is the whole of creation. It is difficult at best to reconcile the idea of an interventionist God with the autonomy of a universe that is constantly evolving. The idea of God as non-interventionist fits in much better with our scientific understanding. Science provides many explanations for life that are not addressed in the Bible. As discussed before, given the time that the Bible was written, this is logical. But God created the world in a way that allows us to expand our understanding beyond what is written down in his word. Since we are able to, it is reasonable to gather that he would encourage us to do so, arguably to know him better. If God created all that is, it would make sense that a priority for creation is to know God. Science is able to provide us with many answers, but is unable to fill in all the gaps. I am not proposing a God of the gaps theory, as this would mean that as gaps of knowledge are filled, the room for God to occupy diminishes. It seems reasonable, though, that assuming that God is responsible for creation, he would act in ways that would allow for the autonomic integrity of creation through secondary causes within the laws of nature. By the same token, God's understanding of the laws of the natural world would certainly be different than our understanding. So when the laws of nature seem to be bending from our perspective, as is the case with miracles, it is plausible that God is still working within them in ways that we cannot yet comprehend.
Scientifically, we have never found any evidence that there is any power greater than the physics of the universe. Proof of God eludes us, but so does proof that there is no God. Christian faith is strong, and there is no evidence that it will falter as a whole in the foreseeable future. As such, to view science as a method to systematically discredit religion would be a grave error that will continue to push apart these two ways of understanding the world. But it is also an error to assume that all that is contained in the Bible is all that can be considered true. Science has undeniably taught us things that we were not even imaginable to the authors, and so there must be more to the story than what the Bible has to say.
The word science comes from the Latin word scire, to know. It refers to knowledge gained empirically by systematic study. A scientific theory isn't just an idea. It's a statement that the scientific community holds to be factual based on an overwhelming body of evidence. Evolutionary theory holds up to this high standard, and the explanation of evolution as the mechanism for the rise of humanity is observable through the fossil records. As anthropologists have made new ancestral fossil discoveries, they have enriched our understanding of our evolutionary lineage rather than discredited it. A literal interpretation of the Bible does not hold up to this scrutiny, nor could it be expected to. It was written at least 2,000 years ago, well before humans could have even begun to comprehend how expansive our wealth of knowledge would become. But scientific knowledge can add to and enrich the biblical account of our existence, how we came to be, our purpose, and even how we can see God act. And the Bible can certainly offer some insight into the existential question of why that science is unequipped to even attempt to answer.